All right, good evening, everyone. It's a beautiful night out, so I'm glad that you chose to spend it here with us tonight. Welcome to Class 4. So we're halfway done officially. We've got 6 classes in total, so after today we'll be in the home stretch here. I promise the heat's on as much as I can. All right, so we're going to start with some survey questions from those of you that responded to the survey. As always, thank you. There were some good ones here that required me to do a little bit of research, and so I'll just go through them quickly. First, there's a school of thought out there that says the development patterns of the past 60 years are anything but resilient and are starting to fail, and I'd love to hear more about this. So I'm not going to pass judgment on different development eras, but I will say that whenever we learned last time when we talked about resiliency that anytime you have all your eggs concentrated in one basket, whether that's one type of housing product or one type of retail or one type of transportation, then anytime something happens to that one type of thing, you can have challenges. And so as we have built communities that are for one type of person and one type of home and one type of transportation, yes, I do have some concerns about the resiliency of that product. There's a question about the pattern book and the timing as it relates to adoption of that and the maps and the classes. The pattern book, if you've been involved with our processes before, the land use plan is something that happens every 10, 15 years or so, and then it's not touched in between. The pattern book is intended to be much more evolutionary than that. And so even though it will be, there's a point in time right now where we want to get it started, that's not to say in 6 months or 9 months as we learn more, as we deploy it through the mapping process, that we can't make adaptations and evolutions to that and change it. And so it's kind of a new system that we're introducing. We're trying to be a little more evolutionary than revolutionary, although this first step probably is quite revolutionary. There's a question about disaster preparedness and planning as it relates to our last class on resilience, specifically involving Homeland Security and IMPD and the Community Emergency Response Teams, or CERT. I have to admit that it's hard to put planning into buckets. Everything in planning relates to one another, and that's the exciting thing, but it's also the frustrating thing to teach because it's hard to segment out. I will say that this plan that we're working on right now, the land use plan, is more about how we can make our community more resilient before a disaster happens. We do have a plan called the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Plan, which is a plan that Homeland Security locally prepares. That will be updated as part of our Sustainability and Resilience Action Plan that will get underway starting next year. And so that piece of planning, the disaster preparedness, is mostly part of that project. There's a multi-part question, but one related to transit plans and how does it keep up with jobs that keep spreading across. I can point you to the Central Indiana Transit Plan or the Marion County Transit Plan for the specific plans about what Indy Connect has proposed, about what the referendum dollars are going for. But as far as it relates to our land use plan, just note that there's a relationship, I hope that you got across, there's a relationship between density of jobs, density of the people, proximity of those things. The more we spread them apart, the more it costs us to move people between them. And so it's definitely harder once you start spreading jobs out farther and farther. It makes it much harder to start connecting them with different modes of transportation. All right, and then the question that kind of relates a lot to what we're talking about tonight as far as inclusiveness relates to my comment I think I made last time, or I might have made it a couple times, about the idea of gentrification and displacement compared to the issue of reverse gentrification, where we've got neighborhoods that are losing value and losing income. And we've got both phenomenons going on in the city. And so know a little bit more about that. And so to start off, this is the Urban Institute, which is a think tank out of DC, has published a report, and there's a link at the bottom if you want to go there and actually read it, that compared homeownership rates over the past few decades. And you can see there that since the Fair Housing Act was passed in the late 60s, and about 2000, black homeowners gained 5 or 6% in homeownership. White homeowners did a little bit better, but not a whole lot. But then you can see what's happened since 2000. And so virtually every gain that black homeowners made since the Fair Housing Act has been wiped away by the Great Recession. And so clearly, the impacts of foreclosures and homeownership and building equity have not been shared equally across our community. And so I'm going to read a line from that report that's somewhat kind of confusing, and then I'll show it what it looks like on the ground here in Indy. So the relationship between decline and the racial composition of the census tract, while present, is not strong. While tracts with less than 20% African American population tended to be found less often among the declining tracts, so were tracts with 60 to 80% African American population. We found no consistent relationship between racial composition and trends in either income, house values, or recent sales price trends. So a little bit of confusing story there. We see that all the gains that Black Americans have gained in homeownership since the Fair Housing Act was passed have been wiped out. But at the same time, the research suggests that there's no connection between racial composition and homeownership. Now, on the ground here in Indy, this is what it looks like. And so the question was, I mentioned that we've got a third of our city that's losing income and losing equity, basically. That obviously impacts homeowners because they're losing equity, but how does that compare for renters? And so in those types of neighborhoods, is it mostly renters, is it mostly homeowners? And so this map is the percent of people that are homeowners, regardless of race. And what I have done, so the darker colors are primarily more homeowners, the lighter colors are more renters. The blue outlined areas are the places where between 2000 and 2014, both median income and housing value declined in real numbers by greater than 20%. And so those are areas where we're seeing massive losses of income as well as property values. The areas in black are the areas that most people would consider gentrifying. And so those are areas that were low income in 2000, but today showed signs of very strong income and housing price growth. And so that's the geography that we're working on. And so if you look at the areas in blue, they're kind of mid-market areas. They're not extremely high homeowner, but they're also not extremely low homeowner. They're kind of in the middle there. And then I teased out the same graph by looking at the percent of African American homeowners. And so the areas in the darker red are the places where black homeowners have a greater percentage of the homes with the same blue and black lines. And so you can see, especially in the Martindale-Brightwood community, there in the near northeast side, we've got a lot of African American homeowners there living in neighborhoods that are losing greater than 20% of their home values and incomes. And so, once again, not all of our populations in central Indiana experience our city in the same way. So this is kind of what we're going to talk tonight a little bit about. And Lee Evans from Maple and Fall Creek Development Corporation is going to talk to us a little bit about gentrification, displacement, and some of the efforts in her experience working in the Maple and Fall Creek neighborhood. So previously in People's Planning Academy, we learned about budgets and planning versus zoning. Planning is the guide, zoning is the law. We learned about the importance of the built environment and how it dictates our health. Last time we learned about resiliency and some of the changing climate conditions that we face, primarily extreme precipitation events as well as warming temperatures. We learned some about the supply and demand of different product types and how that impacts the resiliency of our neighborhoods. A lot of you were interested in learning about the changing demographics, household sizes, and how that changes demands for different types of homes as well as the businesses that they can support. And then we ended with talking about social resiliency and about how we build places can also impact how people build relationships with one another. And so we gave you a homework assignment, and a lot of you focused on that social resiliency piece. And so these are just some of your tweets or Facebook posts or Instagram posts about what makes a neighborhood resilient. And so social gatherings, people come together, Indy welcomes all, people come together to talk about issues like hunger, flood walls, picking up trash, coming together as a community, beautifying natural areas, gardens, next door neighbors, picking up trash, picking up mail while you're out, things like that. So those are things that make our community more resilient. A lot of the non-resilient things focused on stuff that the city does, and so our traffic infrastructure, right? So whether that's giant potholes that have giant barrels in them or just traffic conditions overall, and so those things that do not make your neighborhoods more resilient. And so that's a quick recap. We've got a big topic tonight that I want to get right into. We do want to have lots of discussion. You've had lots of questions about this topic of the past few weeks, and so we want to make sure that we give you ample time to ask questions to our presenters tonight. And so first, we're going to kick off with Maury Planbeck, who is our host tonight. He's the Director of Neighborhood Development for Indianapolis Neighborhood Resource Center. He's going to be talking to us about neighborhoods for all incomes and ages. And then Lee Riley Evans with Mapleton Fall Creek will be up talking about displacement. And then I come back and talk about my favorite presentation, which is the dark side of planning, not because the dark side is something to be proud about, but it's something I want to make sure that never happens again. And so with that, I would like to introduce Maury Planbeck.
Thank you, Brad. I am happy to be here tonight, even though this is my workplace. And I'm sad that I couldn't be here for the other presentations. I've had some family issues going on, but I'll be here Saturday and hopefully for the next People's Planning's Academies through the Thursdays and Saturdays. And so I'm going to talk to you about inclusiveness in the sense of age and in the sense of income and just in the sense of differences in people's abilities and differences in people. And I'm kind of an interactive kind of person, so I will ask questions and hope that you will provide input as I ask them. So we're going to discuss a little bit about what it means to be inclusive, how to get some people involved. You're all involved, that's good. Glad to see, for me, having been a government employee before, many of you are new faces to me, and I'm very happy to see that. We want to involve a wide variety of age groups and a wide variety of income levels, and that's very important in the planning process because not just one age group and not just one income group lives in the city of Indianapolis or any city. So here at the Indianapolis Neighborhood Resource Center, our philosophy is based on asset-based community development. Does anyone know what that is? And I know a couple people do know what that is. What's asset-based community development? Anyone willing to share?
I guess focusing on the particular assets that your community has and working to build on them rather than simply focusing on what your community needs.
That's correct. It's focusing on the assets that a community has rather than the needs of what a community has. The reason that that's important is it's not ignoring the fact that there are needs. We all know that there are needs in a community and that there are problems that need to be fixed. But if you focus on the problem and you fix the problem, you don't have anything to move on to the next problem. If you focus on the asset, that asset or those assets may be able to fix many problems and may go to a long way to long-term improvement in a neighborhood. And many of the assets in neighborhoods are people. One of the strongest assets in neighborhoods are people. And so as you look at asset-based community development and the people, you need to build relationships. And so here at INRC, we talk a lot about community engagement. I've just had two days of classes where I talked about how to get different types of people involved in your community. So getting different people involved finds out what people believe is important to the neighborhood. As we all think of why we think how neighborhoods should grow, everybody else might think something different. And we can't be speculating for what other people think and plan that way. And in particular, and I'm going to keep repeating this, varying ages and varying incomes are very important to look at. So this is some basic information about population in Indianapolis in 2015, and it's on age. And with that number, the total population was 449. And you can see that there is a wide variety of ages represented in this population group, with the largest age group being 25 to 34 years, and the lowest number being 85 years or over, which makes total sense, probably. But when you look at these numbers, and you look around the room, okay, I can't do this, and I won't do this, but I think it would be fun to find out where you all fit in these age groups, but I'm not going to do that. But if you look around the room, I can tell you I'm in one of the lower bottom ones down there. I'll say that. I'll say that. But if you look around the room, do you think that you represent what Indianapolis is? And just think about that. Look around the room and see if you think it does. Anyone have any speculation about that or comment about that? How do you get people of different ages involved in our neighborhoods? So the question is, doesn't it depend on your neighborhood? I'm going to let you follow up. I think I have a speculation on why you said it that way. You're probably saying depending on what age groups are in your neighborhood. Right. That's certainly true. In this sense, tonight, we're representing all of the city, right? So hopefully we have a representative of all the city. But yeah, if you have a neighborhood of seniors, you're probably going to have more representation of seniors. If you have a neighborhood of young families, certainly that's going to be the highest representation. But that doesn't mean it's all the representation. Pretty much every neighborhood is going to have some variety in the ages. So why is it important to think about how younger people should comment on planning and be involved in planning? They're going to be around the longest. Hopefully they are. Changes are going to happen for them like changes have happened in my life over the last 60 years. So as we are planning, we're planning for younger people. What about people with families?
I mean, I guess they raise those younger people. So.
Okay, I didn't really hear you.
They raise those younger people.
They raise those younger people. So certainly, they've got a stake in their children moving forward. What about middle-aged people? I know that's a wide variety. Wisdom. Yes, I like that one a lot. People who are middle-aged are wise and have experienced life in this city or other cities or other places. And that wisdom is very important to knowing how we should go forward. We should not forget that wisdom, forget that knowledge. So all of those things are very important in the sense of ages in Indianapolis. Wait, I'm going to go back. Brad, how do I go back? Okay, so how many people have lived in their house for over 20 years? Almost half. 20 years is a long time. How many people feel that their bodies have changed a lot in 20 years and their house hasn't? A few people are raising your hands. I've lived in my house over 20 years. My house has changed to accommodate a family member whose life has changed dramatically physically. But it wouldn't have if we didn't do that purposely. So in order for people to live in their house and in their neighborhood, changes have to be made as people age. Do you know what a naturally occurring retirement community is? Somebody want to say what that is?
Sun City, rather, and somehow that became a senior community. It wasn't by purpose, it was just by happenstance, where elderly people started moving in. You have to build a community center for seniors, and then people just started booming in there at that senior age, and now the whole community is virtually the whole community is senior population.
That's pretty close. So what the example was in Sun Valley, California, neighborhood evolved into a neighborhood of seniors and it wasn't really designed that way. Is that correct? That's actually what a NORC, or naturally occurring retirement community is. That as many families in a neighborhood age, they're living in a neighborhood where they bought when they probably had families. The neighborhood doesn't change to accommodate the needs for seniors. And so we need to be aware of that and plan for that, because I think most people ideally want to stay in their neighborhood through most of their life, or in their house through most of their life. So that's very important. Other ways to make, what are some other ways to make that work? If you don't stay in your house, but you want to stay in your same neighborhood. Mixed housing, that's a perfect example. Mixed housing meaning you might move from a single family house to a one-story townhouse or something like that. Or maybe you're going to move to apartments so you don't have to do the maintenance that you had to do in your single family house. We all know that mowing the lawn and painting the house is all very difficult. So in order for those communities to accommodate the different ages of people as it occurs naturally, there has to be units like that available for different types of people. So that's very important in the planning process. Okay, so we're going to talk about incomes a little bit. So I didn't ask you to tell your age. Well, I'm certainly not going to ask you to tell your income, and I'm not going to talk about my income either. But as you can see from this, the incomes vary widely in Indianapolis. I would assume you would expect that to be. The largest income group is the 50 to 74,000 or 75,000 group, and the smallest is 200,000 or more. We probably all want to be that. But the median household income in Indianapolis is $42,000 approximately. So you can't tell this by looking at people, but do you think all income groups are represented here today?
Why is it the total households of over 330,000?
That's not the number of people, that's the households. So households are families.
I would say no, I don't, but because it says less than 10,000 is 33,352, and I know we have a lot of homeless people, so I wonder if they're counted in there too.
Oh, they certainly probably are. We may or may not have homeless people here. We may or may not have very low income people here. We may or may not have people of high incomes in this group. Certainly we have a variety of incomes in this group. So if you're a person that doesn't have very much income and you're in a neighborhood, what are you going to worry about? Food? Somebody said food, and somebody said something else that I didn't hear.
Shelter?
Jobs? Transportation?
Shelter?
Health?
No, I didn't say health, I said shelter. Housing.
What?
Housing.
Housing? Shelter. Any other things? Taxes. If you are a very high income, what are you going to worry about? Nothing? Is that true? Anyone very high incomes think that's true? That's probably not quite true. But their worries are going to be a little bit different, and their concerns about the environment, their concerns about the city are probably going to be a little bit different than the low income. The ideal neighborhood, you have both, or you have all. We learn from different people. We learn from people that have different incomes, and we support each other. We have many neighborhoods that don't have that are generally the same income. And that is probably reasons that some neighborhoods change a lot over the years, because there hasn't been a diversity, and that diversity in incomes doesn't follow through as the next generation comes. We have very strong neighborhoods that have a wide variety of incomes and have historically done so. Most of those are probably in the older part of the city, where there are blocks, and on those blocks we sometimes have commercial areas. Oftentimes the housing near those commercial areas is costs less than the housing further away from them. So it allows for lower income people to live in the same neighborhood as higher income people. It's an important thing to consider as we're planning. Yes, Carol?
So then how would you include them, because a lot of times those with low income don't have the educational skills or to understand how the process works, and they don't have the resources for, say, internet or those in their house, and so they're almost disenfranchised from even participating in a process.
So Carol asked, I happen to know Carol. So Carol asked how you would include low-income families because they might lack the resources or the concerns or the ability to be involved in a process like this. That's what my exercise is at the end. So that little sheet with orange is going to help us talk about that. Another part of having mixed incomes is you often then have people in the neighborhood 24 hours. You know, people that work at night are going to be there in the day. People in the work in the day are going to be there at the night. Going back to the seniors, you might have retired seniors that are there all the time. So it's good to have those eyes and ears on the neighborhood all the time. You also have to be, we also have to be concerned about affordability. You know, if neighborhoods don't have a variety of housing options, many people don't have the choice to live in certain places. The things that you talked about that low-income families worry about, transportation, taxes, all of that, add to the anxiety of them being able to find places to live. And we live in a society where everybody should have the equal access to housing, and planning should help do that. So how do you get people involved? That's kind of the rest of my thing. How do you get people involved? So everybody that I'm talking about has gifts. And gifts aren't related to age, and gifts aren't related to income. They're just different based upon the individuals. And so it is up to you all to have conversations with the other people in your neighborhoods and find out what their gifts are. Their gifts might be not applicable to a planning process, or they might not be able to be involved, but they might be applicable. And we don't know that until we start asking them. And in the case of neighborhood planning, the best people to know the neighbors are the neighbors themselves. And you can develop strategies to do that. It's not something that's particularly easy to do. It's not something that a lot of people like to do. It's probably easier for people that are more outgoing than the people that are introverts. But if you make plans for it, there's ways to get people involved. So there are already people involved in your neighborhood. All of you, I assume, are involved. And those are the easiest people to find out some history about their neighborhood and who they might know you should go talk to get involved. So as you're thinking about what Carol's comment was, how do you get other people involved, talk to the influential people in the neighborhood already. And they say, oh, they might say, so-and-so used to be involved 20 years ago, now they're older, they're not involved, but that so-and-so is going to have a lot of history that they can use. So there's lots of other groups in the neighborhood that you need to consider. We talked about senior citizens, we talked about youth a little bit. People with disabilities certainly have and are impacted by planning. There's probably people in here with disabilities, but I can't see them. There's people that have disabilities that are very visible. And so getting people like that involved, getting people of different races, from different countries, different religions, and even homeless involved in the process or thinking about that is very important. There's lots of different festivals and things that you can do to get people involved in the neighborhood that are not necessarily involved in this planning process, but it's ways to get people involved and you can find out what they think. And so these are some examples that are happening in different neighborhoods, and they are for different age groups and different types of people. Connectors is also another way to get people involved, and that relates to the people that know, who have been there a long time. If you're somebody new in the neighborhood, it's really good for you to get a connector, someone that's been there a long time, because there's going to be a lot of trust there already. If you're new, there's probably not going to be too much trust, but you can use that connector to get trust. And then the strategies to foster inclusion is the form that I gave you. And so this is just an example of different ways to get people involved. One, the column on the left in front of you that you have is supporting differences in culture and background. And here, example is host a multicultural fair, or create a survey listening to the abilities of people in your neighborhood. You can enhance community life different ways by creating a community garden. I know people in here that have done that. Encourage the use of neighborhood businesses. They're your neighbors too. Host a community cleanup. Lots of people have done that. And then there's two other examples relating to developing relationships and outreach opportunities for everything. So what I thought you could do for 5 minutes, do I have 5 minutes left?
Maybe 3.
I have 3 minutes left. I at least asked. I have 3 minutes left. Okay, that means for 2 minutes, quickly talk about some of these at your table. And I'm going to time it, and then 2 minutes I want you to throw out some ideas and ask me questions after that. Okay, 2 minutes goes really quickly unless you're standing up here by yourself in front of everyone. So Brad only gave me 1 more minute, you heard that. Who wants to throw out some ideas to make more inclusive neighborhoods in Indianapolis? Anyone? Have a block party. Get people in the neighborhood to mingle together. Great idea. Marissa?
Every Valentine's Day we have, well, not Valentine's Day, Valentine's Week, we have speed neighboring. So we kind of bring everyone together and they do like neighbor bingo. So they get to know different aspects of everyone else.
Speed neighboring. I've never heard that. It's like speed dating. Yeah, like speed dating. And they play bingo.
And you get prizes.
In the Little Flower neighborhood. That sounds fantastic, actually. With the tie. He's behind you, Carol, and then you, Carol, next. With the guy with the tie. I don't know.
I just mentioned this anecdotally. So, communities, Little Flower, Emerson Heights, and Irvington were all opposed to one gas station that came into the neighborhood after tearing a bunch of historical buildings down so no one patronizes them. That's an interesting way of drawing it.
Some people, that is very, very divided. I'm from Little Flower, and some people don't care. They're like, the gas station exists now, let's support it. We don't want to abandon gas station in our neighborhood. And other people are still pretty sore about the whole thing, whatever set foot on.
Yeah.
So what I think the point was, if you have some controversy in your neighborhood, you get a lot of people involved. Is that what your point was? Yeah, that's totally true. I know that from experience, maybe. Yeah.
Supported bakeries where they wanted to take out that whole place and put in a Burger King. And I mean, there were lawyers and realtors and everybody involved in keeping the Burger King out of the neighborhood.
So that's a way to get people involved, and it was work. Carol, and then I think I'm done.
Well, Brad's on your shoulder.
I know.
He's like the taskmaster, so I will defer.
Okay.
So, thank you, Maury. We'll hopefully all have time at the end. We'll bring Maury and Lee back up here. But I do want to get on to Lee Riley Evans, who is the Executive Director of Mapleton Fall Creek Development Corporation, which is an area of town, if you don't know, just north of Fall Creek, south of the fairgrounds. It's had a lot of activity lately, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about her involvement in that and some of the challenges that might bring. Lee?
So excited to be here, looking forward to our conversation and very much open to questions from you and getting into a dialogue. As we get started, however, I want to offer that a challenge, honestly. When we think about the changes that have occurred in the neighborhood, one of the first terms that comes to mind is gentrification. And so I challenge you today to think of doing away with that word. It is very politically charged and often misdefined, or undefined rather. And I think it's a distraction from what the real issues are in terms of increased poverty and displacement of individuals, and figuring out how we concentrate on the assets in a neighborhood, whether that be the rooftops or that's the retail. The role that Mapleton Fall Creek Development Corporation plays is the conjunction between those two. And so we work at connecting the neighborhood partners to bring in investment to the neighborhood, to assist, help serve the residents, the partners, the organizations, to improve what's happening in our community. And as Brad mentioned, that community predominantly is from Fall Creek up to 38th Street. Fall Creek serves as the south and eastern boundary, and then it goes across 38th Street to Crown Hill Cemetery down around Ivy Tech. So take whether you call it Michigan or Northwestern or how long you've lived in Indianapolis, that road past 65 down to Fall Creek. So that's the area where we serve to connect individuals, to make sure that we're recognizing the assets that Maury mentioned earlier, and to impact the perception of this space beyond just the fact that there could or could not be rising housing costs, which are often the conclusions that people want to speak to when they use the term gentrification. And so what I want to make sure that we also talk about in real estate terms is there's that location, location, location. That's the first thing that everybody thinks about when they try to figure out where it is they want to live. This is the intersection in the 1950s of 30th and Central. Very much a vibrant space. You could honestly receive everything you needed in a community at this intersection. There was the opportunity for housing, there was a fuel station, regardless of your opinion on if a gas station should or shouldn't be in the neighborhood. It is a very auto-centric community that we live in. You need fuel to get to work, to get to your job, to get to your cultural, faith-based activities. The drugstore was there, so there was the wellness opportunity. There was food there. And as you can see, there were people walking, engaging. This actual shot is from an accident, so there had actually been some interaction between the individuals there, but that just gives you an idea of what a healthy community could look like. And around this time in Center Township, there were more than 300,000 people that lived in Center Township. As a result of changing priorities and interests and less desire to live in the urban core, we started to suffer through decades of disinvestment, decades of loss of population, to the point by 2010, it had declined to just under 142,000 individuals. And so very different from the picture you see here in 1950s, late 50s, early 60s, when we were at the height of the population in Center Township. You get to the intersection now. This is a picture of that same intersection about 2 years ago. I want to say it was October of 2015 when we took this picture. Exact same intersection, same vantage point, looking west on 38th Street. 3/4 of the corners are empty. Very few people are walking or even driving. We've made efforts to change that traffic into a two-way, as you can see by the one lane that has the only word on the pavement. But this is a challenge when you have deteriorating tax base, a growing threat of public safety, and a once healthy and vibrant community gets to a point where there are an estimated 142,000 people. By 2010, the American Community Survey suggests that maybe it had grown slightly to 144,000 population in Center Township, but this is a very indicative of the work that we are trying to do to create value for the urban core, to encourage people to come back to the Center Township area of Indianapolis, and specifically Mapleton, Fall Creek, and the other mid-north neighborhoods that surround the Children's Museum, which I often describe as the central anchor institution in the triangle that I described earlier by catchment area. There are 6 neighborhoods there, including Mapleton, Fall Creek, Historic Watson Park, Historic Meridian Park, Crown Hill, Highland Vicinity, and Meridian Highland. And so there are tremendous historical assets as well as the people. There are the anchor institutions, and so we want, again, to make sure that we continue to not displace individuals, and because there is the preference to have a shorter commute and to make sure that you have access to your jobs and your employment centers, Mapleton, Fall Creek, and the Mid-North area of Indianapolis can be ideal for those interests. And so houses are closer together. They're also closer to the employment centers. This is another great example of how now a very deserted space in the community at one point was a thriving space. This is the Czarine Theater at the intersection of 28th and Central. If you can think of where the Julia Carson Government Center is, this is just across the street from that. This building was a active location and was demolished, very similar to those other buildings at the intersection of 30th and Central. But again, it's about location and creating value for the people and keeping them in their place, providing support for them to grow and to stimulate population growth. We're seeing very similar trends in Mapleton, Fall Creek to what's happening throughout Indy's urban areas. And so our role, again, is that conjunction, that sticky stuff between the two, is to make sure that we're using public, private, as well as philanthropic investment to support a comprehensive approach to minimize the displacement. We want to make sure that people continue to improve educationally, health-wise, and to make it possible for them to have a high quality of life in that neighborhood. And we're doing that because of some catalytic neighborhood stabilization program funding, as well as the opportunity to just leverage the support of our partners. This is a quick example of some of the residential investment that has occurred in the neighborhood. This is an example of a property that had been vacant for more than 20 years that we were able to make look like this and created a home for memories for a family that now is 10. When they bought the house in 2012, there were only 7 of them. They've added to that. But this opportunity is a prime example of how we have infused affordable options into keeping people in the neighborhood. And so as there's the fear of rising house prices, we will use funding such as community development block grants to restrict the incomes of who lives in our home, to make sure that we are being very intentional with our infill construction as well as the renovation of property instead of demolishing property, creating space for the historical value of the property that exists. Occasionally there are some homes that have gotten beyond repair, and so those homes may have to be demolished. And as I often describe, the snaggletooth streets that are the result of that, we will do the infill construction with the same restrictive income dollars to continue to make it possible for a mixed income community to exist. Lastly, there are just the infrastructure improvements. This is the space that makes it possible for the retail to come, for the businesses to be there, so that the residents stay and want to continue to grow. We often, as found in studies of the impacts of rising house prices, is that people move less because there continues to be an improve in quality of life. They then have trails available for them to walk on. Those businesses start to stay longer and offer additional resources. Bridges are repaired, making it possible to get across the streets more safely and to slow down traffic. And so there are millions of dollars of improvements that occur in making the water smell less like sewage and making it possible for you to transform a natural asset into a space that people want to swim and play and canoe down, as opposed to reading signs that say don't touch, don't get in because it's toxic. And so just those long-term controls to impact Fall Creek as a natural asset from a toilet 60 days out of the year, it now will be a space that has been transformed for us to enjoy as an asset, and those trails are making it possible for us to get down there and for others to enjoy living in the space. And we do that through a very comprehensive approach. There's a copy of our mission statement again. We focus on housing, whether it's ownership or rental. We want to make sure that there's a promotion of entrepreneurship in our neighborhood and support the businesses that stay while we're also trying to attract other businesses. We want to incorporate creative public art into the neighborhoods and make sure that there are adequate green spaces to improve health and outcomes. In the zip code of 46205 and 46208, those individuals are often living 10 to 15 years less than someone in a northern and southern zip code of our service area. So having access to trails and parks makes it possible for you to improve your life as well as your health and to live longer and enjoy a quality of life that we think is important. And so we do that again through sustaining an approach to the waterway and the community, and most important, connecting people throughout all of that neighborhood. And so we are responsible for impacting our community, impacting our environment, impacting our economy, impacting our house, and then making it possible for everyone to live life better in Mapleton Fall Creek. So that's who we are. I want to make sure that I give some time for your comments and conversations about how we do what it is that we do to minimize displacement, to attract investment, and to support the work of the City of Indianapolis and other partners like INRC to improve our community.
Hi, Lee.
Hello.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say that, you know, I would agree that I would like to get rid of gentrification as well, but my question is, how does Mapleton Fall Creek deal with the issue of, like, you know, we've heard stories about in Fountain Square where, you know, when higher income individuals move in, invest in property, their houses, or start to rent or lease, that others get priced out. So how do you deal with that in the sense of keeping, I guess, the price of rentals down? If seniors have homes and the area around them gets built up, the property tax goes up and they may not be able to pay their property tax and lose their houses. So how do you address those things?
Through a variety of issues. One of the ways that we address it, as I mentioned, is using funds that restrict income. And so, as an example, 25 of the houses that we renovated over the last several years required that you did not make more than 120% of the average median income. So, quick numbers, household of 5, you couldn't make more than $73,000 on an annual basis. So that's one of the ways that we do that. Some of those funds also allow us to work with those seniors to repair their homes. For the last 2 years, that's been our focus. Instead of building homes, we've been renovating and repairing homes for seniors and others on fixed income, so they don't have to choose between fixing their roof and buying their medication or paying their property taxes. And so those funds are available to repair their roof or add a grab bar or give them a new furnace because they don't have the funds to repair it themselves. So that's a second way that we do it. And then third, we impact legislators. We make sure that we're advocating on behalf of our residents, whether it's our board members or the neighborhood associations. All 6 of those neighborhoods have neighborhood associations that are very strong advocates and trying to impact policy so that there is actual legislation that says that there cannot be certain limits on, so that there can be certain limits on property tax and create some community benefit agreement for the seniors that have lived there long.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, sir, the tie.
Thank you.
Yeah, you and then the Adidas t-shirt. I don't have anybody's name, sorry.
Can I suggest that California has an interesting model to preserve neighborhoods and keep this otherwise known as gentrification coming on and displacing people who have been longtime residents that all of a sudden find their property taxes climbing up because it's a natural consequence of economic development. And that is the longevity of a person, the length of time a person stays in a house should qualify for property tax mitigation. That will stabilize a lot of, and it'll stop this nonsense because I know that I work for a not-for-profit and we create and promote trails across the state. Well, that was one of our red flag objections when over here on near west, just west of the White River in Hawville, there's a lot of economic development going on, and we're saying, well, who's going to protect the homeowners? You know, from the homes there all of a sudden are going to be impacted by taxes that they're not used to paying, and they're not based their economy on higher rates of property.
Right. Well, and there's some current efforts. there was a House bill, and the number honestly just escapes me. I want to say 1025, but
1056.
thank you. And so it's being studied right now, but we can't get it through the state legislation in terms of creating some of those property tax protections. And so I would encourage you to contact Representatives Cherish Pryor as well as Greg Porter at the state level. Locally, Councilor Bob Osley is working very adamantly on addressing some of those issues. The model in California is one that we could replicate, but we have to make sure that we challenge our elected officials as well as the constituents who vote for them or don't to make some changes that will protect the community. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's what I was going to speak to. Representative
Cherish.
She has a bill in the House, 1056, just went down there 2 weeks ago for the hearing. It has a fiscal impact statement with it now. That is going to move through the House this next session, and hopefully one of those representatives will put it on the table and have it read and bring it up. I would suggest everybody in this room gang up on your state legislatures and let them know that you support this, especially you in the room with R's under your representative's title, because those are the ones, people that are really making the decisions, the ones with the R's behind their names down at the State House. I would push them heavily to support this bill. The other thing is, we learned there are tools in your assessor's toolbox that they can use to keep your property taxes low. It has to be on an individual parcel basis. You have to go and tell your assessor you're worried about this and you would like them to do something, but there are tools in their toolbox to help them keep your property taxes low. The Monroe County assessor was at that meeting, and she discussed how she uses her tools in her toolbox to keep this senior's $55,000 home on this lot, keep those property taxes down, when there's a $250,000 house that was freshly built right next to hers that tore down the old house there to build a $250,000. And it's happening all over the west side of Bloomington right now, where people are worried about gentrification or worried about their taxes going up because of increased property tax value.
Yeah, the big issue, honestly, is fear. I mean, that's the other reason. We need to make sure that we are addressing, not using that term as a distraction, but actually addressing the real issue and putting things in place to impact the how much fear we have on those rising prices. I'm going to go here to the gentleman in the Revolution t-shirt and then back to you, ma'am.
I just have a question. I've lived in Indianapolis my whole life, and I can remember when we used to have problems in the Butler-Tarkington area and also the Medford-Fall Creek area as far as crime.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what did you guys do to turn that around? Because we're not going to be able to get into other neighborhoods until we get that figured out in this city.
Well, I'm not sure who mentioned it up here, but unfortunately it was a problem that brought people together. There was the increase of homicides and drug activity, and it got to a point, probably 2008, 2009, when about 500 residents came together and said, okay, enough is enough. There have to be some other ways of existing. We can't be scared to walk down our streets. We can't have the inability to walk down our streets because sidewalks don't exist. Let's figure out a plan and start implementing that. And so that was one of the ways we did it, and started to work very closely with IMPD, welcoming them into the neighborhood. We have 68 rental properties. We offered some as a substation. We offered some as a place to put cameras. We offered some as a place for individuals to come and do a roll call or to use the restroom if necessary. And so it really was a community-based effort to change and create value for the space. And so walking the streets, having regular meetings, having conversations, and specifically establishing plans, everything from aesthetics to youth engagement, business development, housing, senior engagement, health, and putting some timelines and deadlines against it. There were nearly 120 action items, and our organization is the lead implementing partner for the majority of those action items. Destination Fall Creek was one of those outgrowths. And so we had to stop going along with what was happening and change the course of the crime that was happening. Our mission was about creating a safe community. We had to start fulfilling that. Yes, and
sell their home because of outrageous property taxes, and people whose taxes have gone up drastically due to gentrification in their neighborhood, long-time homeowners, and they want you to contact your city councilman. I would contact them about any tax issues right away. That's Bob Boston, Zach Adams, and it's also related to seriously involved with that bill. Let them know, because probably in Indiana, wonderful state that it is, they won't really. I don't anticipate that bill going through this year, but by letting our city councilman know what's going on, we can create pressure to at least have the assessor's office change things overall in Marion County. And have some local impact.
yes, ma'am.
Speaking on the west side of you guys, Crown Hill Neighborhood Association, it's really kind of hard for us olders to eliminate the term gentrification because we live through it, and but we need to get us more open-minded to help be part of the changes that we see is coming. And I remember when south of Fall Creek was a high crime area, which is now called Fall Creek Place or something, and see how that neighborhood changed it completely. The young people don't even know it was as rough as it was over there. So we can do it together. We just have to get more people involved and open up our minds to, okay, it was gentrification. It is gentrification. Let's do something about it. And the gas stations, I don't think the complaint was the gas station. It was they were bringing so many into our neighborhood. Every 4 blocks.
Yeah, unfortunately, also with the fuel becomes the options for convenient food, which is highly processed and not very healthy. So that's also some of the dissatisfaction with gas stations and the increase in crime that often follows the gas station. There's one more over here, and then.
I just wanted to ask you about the rental property in Fall Creek. When it comes to gentrification, aren't those the properties that come up for rent for sale first? And that's how it really takes a foothold.
They can.
And sometimes, it's almost overnight, the house is gone. So I'm just like your.
Yeah, they can. I've often, some of the studies that I've read is one of the interesting byproducts or the discounting of the rising housing prices is that as rents go up, people often move less because of the changes in the community and the amenities that exist. But in addition to the homeownership tools that we use to restrict incomes, those tools exist for rental properties as well. And so there are limits on how much someone can make as well as how much rent can be charged available for rental properties.
Is that basically for your community? I mean, that's what your community
That's some of the tools that we use, but they're available to other communities as well.
But you want the gentrification, but you also don't want every single house, every single rental property given off to gentrification.
Correct.
In the name of gentrification.
Right. And we want there to be a healthy mixed income community. Right. We want a sustainable neighborhood. We want it to be vital, similar to the picture that we showed in 1950, late 50s, early 60s. We don't want it to keep looking like it looks today.
Right.
We want it to make sure that it's an attractive, safe space that's vital again.
And what's the new word for gentrification so I can
We got to figure that out. But I just want to challenge us to think of things differently.
Okay. That's excellent. Thank you.
Right. You're very welcome.
All All right, so I'm glad you brought up renters. Do we have any people who watch The Matrix trilogy? Yeah? So what if I told you that national research, academic research, says that the narrative that people get priced out of their homes because of property taxes, there's no evidence for? Would you believe that? So I don't know if that's the case in Indianapolis, but I will say that national research has shown that. But the people who do get displaced the most are renters. And so that's something to consider as we talk about this issue, is what happens to renters. So if you attended the Neighbor Power preview of this academy, you can't answer. For everyone else, what does this map show? The projectors are kind of washed it out, but any idea what this shows?
Race.
Race? Any other ideas?
There's a number of rental units around the city.
Rental units? So it's race. Now, I'm not going to get into systems theory and thinking, but one of the ideas is that the system is designed to give you the results that you get. And so the fact that we have different races of people living together is no accident. That's not something that just happened. It's something that was very intentional through history. And so I'm going to tell you that story. It's something my profession helped create, and I need to fess up to that. It's very important to me that we do not repeat this, and we do our best to address it. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the dark history of city planning nationally as well as here in Indianapolis. And so every single dot on this map is a person. And so all 939,000 people in Marion County are on this map. Now, 28% are African American, almost 10% are Latino background. If you include all people of color, including Latinos, it's about 43%. About 9% of us came here from another country, so we're immigrants. So why do these patterns exist? That's the story I'm going to tell you tonight. Now, some of the images I'm going to show can be disturbing, and I'll warn you when we get to one. But this gentleman, his name is D.C. Stevenson. Anyone heard about D.C. Stevenson before? Any Irvingtonites here? Yeah, his house is out there. All right, so in early 1920s, the Indiana Klan membership was about 250,000 people. That was about 1/3 of all white men in the entire state. It was led by D.C. Stevenson, who got his start in the state in Evansville before he moved to Irvington to start the first Klan newspaper in the state. Now, in 1923, he kind of rebelled against the national KKK organization and started his own rival organization, which soon outgrew the national, became very powerful. At that point, it switched from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and eventually the governorship and both houses of the state legislature were under Klan influence or control. Soon that extended to the congressional seat for Indianapolis, the mayor of our city, and both control of the city council as well as the school board. And so the Klan had wielded a lot of political power in the early days of our city. So we think today of the Klan as anti-black, anti-African American, right? But in the 1920s, when this was occurring, the enemies were first Catholics. That was the arch enemy of the Klan back in the day, followed by immigrants, and then by black population. And they were more focused on social issues really than they were on race. So they were really interested in prohibition, ending political corruption, although they engaged in it. They were battling adultery, gambling, some of those issues. And a lot of the money that they raised actually went to poor relief and went to helping the poor. Except for Catholics and immigrants and black residents, right? So just think about the issues they were hiding underneath, because this comes back even today. So the next image that I'm going to show you is one of the most haunting things I uncovered when I was doing this research. This is an undated photo, but this is Indianapolis in the 1920s. This is not Selma, this is not Birmingham, this is not Greensboro. all those places where we think this stuff happened. This happened in our back door. This happened to our residents, our neighborhoods. This is right here. So I mentioned that the Klan wielded a lot of political power. In 1926, the council passed an early zoning ordinance. So if you go back, if you remember back in first class, that was about the heyday or when the zoning ordinances first started. And this is a scan of our actual ordinance that was passed by the city council. And I'm going to read it because it's important. That it shall be unlawful for any white person to hereafter establish a home residence on any property located in a Negro community or portion of the municipality inhabited principally by Negroes, or vice versa, basically. And so we legislated segregation through our neighborhoods. If you're a black person, you could not move into a white neighborhood. If you're a white person, you could not move into a black neighborhood. That was city law. And that was 1926. Now, this was not unique. Every city had this. This was the thing of the day, right? Baltimore started it in 1911. Ours came in 1926, and shortly thereafter, the next year, the Supreme Court of the United States deemed all of these ordinances unconstitutional. So those were thrown out. So unable to enforce segregation by public law, people turned to private real estate development law, private methods. One very common one was called racially restrictive covenants. Now, covenants are not enforced by the government. If you live in a modern neighborhood today, a subdivision, you have covenants attached to your property that say you can or can't do this, or you have to do this with your paint colors and all that. Those are covenants. Well, back in the day, back in the 30s and 40s, the covenants dictated what type of person could live in a neighborhood. And this is a scan of the Old Colony edition here in Indianapolis, which is about 45th and Central, so just north of what Lee was talking about at 30th and Central, so that neighborhood. As that neighborhood was changing, new development had these restrictions placed on the property. And so if you read words in there, forever restricted to members of the pure white race. Mm-hmm. And so if I sold my house, as a white male, if I sold my home to a black resident, I could be sued by my neighbors to prevent that from happening. It's not that they just can't live in the neighborhood, but they can't own property. They also cannot move there, cannot even live there. And so a lot of the neighborhoods that were developed around the time of the 30s, so a lot of them Reading Kessler, Forest Hills, neighborhoods like that you think of very well off, well, from the beginning, they were very racially restrictive, and that was by law, by private law. Now, this method, too, was ruled unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1948. These still exist. If you live in one of those older neighborhoods, you can go down to the recorder and you can look this up, and this will still exist. Obviously, it cannot be enforced, but these are still on paper. So going into the 1950s, it was clear that courts aren't going to allow or continue to uphold segregation or discrimination. And then it got really scary because that's when it goes underground, right? So a couple of real estate practices that the real estate community engaged in: steering. And so if you were a black resident looking for a home to purchase, you would be shown a different neighborhood than if you were a white resident, simply because of your race, and vice versa. There was a price differential. And so there was a price for black residents. There was a price for white residents. Not everywhere, but in certain neighborhoods, there was that difference, and that was to discourage neighborhoods from integrating. Some agents engaged in what was called blockbusting. And that's when real estate agents played on racial fears that were beginning to happen in the 1950s and 1960s to scare white homeowners to say, there's a black family moving into your neighborhood, you better get out now. And almost within a year, that entire block would flip from white to black. Now, some agents made a lot of money doing that. Some agents even bought the initial house to flip so that they could get all the business of all the homeowners on that block. It's pretty nefarious practices. Now, this advertisement that you see here is from Chicago, but the Saturday Evening Post is published here in Indianapolis. This advertisement's from 1962. So many of your lifetimes, this stuff was being printed in public newspapers. Now, what is now my board, the Metropolitan Indianapolis Board of Realtors, didn't allow black real estate brokers to be admitted until 1962. So a lot of our city's history, this steering of racial groups into certain neighborhoods was happening. Now, as part of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, all of these practices were made illegal. and they remain illegal today. Now, even before those days, the banking system was beginning to institutionalize racism, although probably not originally by its original intent. FDR, President Roosevelt, in 1933 created the New Deal, and one of the things he was trying to do is to create the secondary mortgage market. So at the time, when you borrowed money from a bank, that bank was out that money until you paid them back. So what he was trying to do is allow that bank to sell that mortgage into the secondary market so they could get that money back out the door and loan more and more and more. And that's the system that we have today, but it didn't exist back in there. Now, to do that, he created something called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. And what they did, they were also interested in mortgage prevention. This was during the Great Depression, right? And so a lot of people were losing their homes. And so he created this corporation. Basically, they borrowed money from private investors, so they sold bonds to buy up troubled mortgages. So that way the banks were not going under, the banks could reloan that money, and we could stabilize neighborhoods. Sound familiar? We just did something similar less than a decade ago. Now, the thing is that the government was on the hook to pay these investors back. And so they didn't want to just buy any mortgage back. They wanted to make sure that there was resale value, right? Makes sense. You're not going to buy an asset that's losing value that you can't pay your investors back. It makes perfect sense. Well, so the way that they did this is they went to every city where they were making the mortgages, or buying up these assets, and they graded neighborhoods. So they graded them A, B, C, or D. So you heard the term redlining before? Well, red was the D grade places. So redlining became a way that banks used to evaluate the risk of neighborhoods. Now, what were they evaluating the risk of? Ma'am, you're from Crown Hill?
Yes.
And so in the Crown Hill neighborhood, every block of color like this, so the green, blue, yellow, or red, there was also a form on the right side of the screen there that you see that talks about its advantages, its disadvantages, things like that. One of the things that graded negatively was a changing racial composition. And so the more black a neighborhood was becoming, the lesser it was graded. Guess who was making these grades? People who looked like me, right? People who were threatened by change because they grew up in a political climate where a third of the state white men were involved in the Klan. And so from the very beginning, our mortgage finance system was set up so that some neighborhoods were condemned so you could not get mortgages in some places. And what does that do to property values? What does that do to home ownership rates? Remember when I started today talking about the survey? We have black home ownership rate has always been lower than white. Why is that? That's by design. And it goes back to practices like this. So in the archives of DMD at the city, we don't throw anything away. And so this is one map we recently uncovered while going through all of our file cabinets. And this basically shows the different areas of town that in a matter of a decade flipped from primarily white to integrated or primarily black. So this is 1967. So you can see in a matter of decades, I talked about blockbusting and things like that. In a matter of decades, entire neighborhoods flipped race. And so what I've done in this is, this might be a little hard to see with the projector, but I put that 1967 map in the middle. On the left, and I outlined in blue the areas that were primarily of color. And then I reverse, I go back in time to that 1937 homeowners loan redlining map and lay it on there. And I fast forward to the 2010 map of race. It's almost identical. It's almost the same map. Now obviously our city has grown and some places have changed. But by and large it is the same map. So it's been almost a century of progress in our city and we still have the same map. Why is that? And then I'm going to wrap up the story of education. And so despite state law requiring it, Indianapolis schools were not segregated until the Klan arrived. In 1922, actually a neighborhood association, Mapleton Civic Association, up in Lee's area now, together with the White Supremacy League, convinced the school board, which was then controlled by the Klan, to segregate elementary schools. Why did they do that? It was under the auspices of public health. So one of the things in planning is that you have to listen for the argument, and you have to listen for the real argument, because they are very rarely the same thing. Most people are pretty tactful in making arguments. And so the public health issue that they raised is because blacks made up 10% of the city population, but they made up a quarter of the deaths. Well, that was mostly because of tuberculosis, which is a communicable disease that is spread easily in crowded housing conditions, which is where the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps forced the African American population to be, right? And so after that victory, pressure for separate high schools happened. That coincided with the movement of a very strong college prep school from a black slum area, which was near Michigan and Penn downtown, to where it is today at 34th and Meridian, which is Shortridge, which was then a very white area. Now, despite court challenges to the contrary of making that happen, Crispus Attucks opened as the first black high school in the nation. Now, you look at this. This is a picture of the original Shortridge downtown. You see black and white students learning together. This is how it was. It works. It works today. But under the auspices of public health, that fake reason, the politics of the day were able to segregate schools. Now, fast forward to today, Indianapolis and Marion County unified in the late 60s. Unigov did not consolidate school districts, right? So Indianapolis has 11 public school districts inside of it. It's kind of crazy. Now, a departure from state law at the time, state law required that school district boundaries and municipal boundaries lined up to make it easy. Well, they exempted that when Unigov happened, and so as a result, we have 11 school districts with IPS in the middle. And that was done for political reasons. Obviously, schools are a big reason where people live, and so in 1971, the desegregation order came down from the federal government, and that basically forced busing starting in 1981, which just ended a couple years ago. So 35 years. Now, the key thing about that busing was it was one way, right? It was out of IPS to the townships. No township schools, no township kids were bused into IPS. So that happened. Now, this is my last slide because I think this is still telling for today. So bused kids from segregated IPS schools to non-segregated ones within IPS, as well as 6 of the 8 townships. Pike and Washington were not part of the busing program because they had higher black percentages at the time. Now, the intent was to give kids more opportunity, which makes sense. You take them from a low-performing school, you put them in a high-performing school, they will do well. The cycle of poverty and inopportunity will be broken, right? That's the theory?
Yeah, that's the theory.
Well, the goal of desegregation failed. So when it started, only 4% of IPS elementary schools had 75% or more students of one race, white or black. Today, 5 times higher. 20% of those schools are that segregated, and 74% of the kids in IPS are black. Now, the graph here, I make complicated graphs. These are all the school districts in central Indiana. The ones in orange are outside the county, the ones in blue are Marion County school districts. The light bar on the top is the percent of white students of the entire school district population in 2000. And then the darker bar is that same school district in 2015. So these are comparing change over time. So every single school district has become more diverse over the past 15 years. Or past 10 years. But you can see there are very few that are actually integrated. They are either white or they are black. And so the point in showing you all of this is because school districts are one of the ways that we segregate neighborhoods today. And it's not by intent, it's not by design. No one stands up there and says this is going to be a white school district and this is going to be a black one. But that's kind of the impact that happens when school districts start changing. And so we have spent, like I said, 100 years working on that map, and it's still driven largely by fear of people who don't look like us. So that's my story of the dark side of city planning. It's very personal to me. It's very important to me. I appreciate you giving me the platform to share that. And we've got 5 minutes or so And we'd be happy to bring Maury back up, to bring Lee up. If you have any questions, happy to answer them.
Brad, you started out by saying, what is it, that the data says that gentrification, people are not displaced because of gentrification? And so I guess my question to you is, I don't know if you read How to Kill a City, but they talk about Detroit, downtown proper, what it looked like now. And of course, yes, it was disinvested and people moved out, and so then that allowed, I guess you would say, entities with money to buy up stuff, and now it looks predominantly white, and you can't really afford to live down there. So I call that gentrification. What do you call it?
So that is neighborhood change. The point I was making was that the research shows that the narrative that a longtime homeowner has their property taxes escalated to such a point where they can't afford them and has to move out, the research shows that that narrative is not true. Now, it may be true in certain places, in certain neighborhoods, certain cities, depending on the different taxing systems, but that narrative. Now, the fact that neighborhoods change and the fact that in a capitalistic society, the people with money always control what happens, at least when development-wise, that happens. And so I'm not gonna discount or argue that that doesn't happen. And so neighborhoods change. And it's largely because the people with money have the opportunity to buy cheap property, make a living doing that. There's nothing wrong with making a living doing that. That's how the system is designed. My point is, the system is designed to give you the results that you get. And so we can try to subsidize every day a house here and a house there and a house here. It's not going to stop the fundamental challenge. And that is that we have populations that have historically been penalized in our planning system, in our equity system, in our mortgage system, in all sorts of systems, right? So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying I completely agree with you. My point was about the narrative about the property tax. Is that, okay. All right, let's go with you here. I'll try to go around clockwise here.
I just have a comment. You said that you concluded with things sort of stay de facto segregated because people are afraid to live with people that look like them. And that statement is inherently very one, because polls show that minorities are okay living in diverse neighborhoods, mixed neighborhoods, but like if a single or two or three black or non-white or families of color move into a white neighborhood, and the white people are like, oh my God, what's happening? And they freak out. And that doesn't happen the other way. So it's not that everyone's afraid of people that look like them, it's that white people are afraid of people of color.
Yep. Okay. Sir, back there?
Are we seeing a change in those neighborhoods that have traditionally been?
So we are seeing changes, and the only constant is neighborhoods change. And so Mapleton Fall Creek and someone mentioned Fall Creek Place south of that, those did not start off, those started off as very well-off white neighborhoods, right? And then that changed, and they're changing back. And so I used to live in Fall Creek Place. Fall Creek Place was a government-sponsored project. 12 renters were relocated out of Fall Creek Place. It was a homeownership zone project. It was to build homeownership opportunities. Today, there are more people of every race living in Fall Creek Place than there were before. But there are a lot more white people you never saw before. And so the change you notice, it's a cultural change, right? And so in many of our core neighborhoods, you are seeing that they're becoming more integrated than they were before. The challenges come down to when that changes long-time neighborhood cultural patterns and activities and relationships and things like that start happening. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
So I just had a recommendation of 2 good resources that I've read before, and one is there was a good NPR story maybe a year ago it's called The Color of Law, which is a book that was written. If you search The Color of Law in NPR, it's a similar history, looking at the racial history of law and housing discrimination. And another one is The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which looks at enslavement to Jim Crow laws in the South to housing discrimination, and kind of tying together a lot of stories and how they connect.
All right, let's go you, ma'am.
I think that us elders, one of the issues we have with the gentrification, Highway 65, where you go, and West Street, Indiana Avenue, Lockfield Gardens, that was traditionally a black community, and a lot of people were pushed out for 65, I mean literally put out in 65, so it's kind of hard to let go of the gentrification that we lived and saw and whatever, but still, again, we've got to be ready to make it for everybody.
Yeah, and you know, she mentioned the interstates. That's something also that planners did, right? That was the thing to do back in the 50s. Those in urban areas, some of them were placed for nefarious purposes. Chicago's former Mayor Daley is on record as saying he put the interstate there to separate races. Other places, they followed the path of least resistance, and that's financially as well as politically. And so when you have a system that condemns entire neighborhoods to cash markets, so there's no property values, it makes it easy to buy up that property and put interstates through them, right? And so again, all of these systems are not necessarily intentionally racial. It's just the impact of them, especially when you start cumulatively adding them, when you have disproportionate impacts on populations. And that's the thing that I hope comes through tonight. All right, a couple more questions in the back.
Yeah, I guess since a lot of ways that people segregated themselves was simply by moving their children to private schools, do you think there would be any, I mean, obviously it's unlikely it would happen, but, and it would probably have to happen at a state level, but what if we just banned private schools so then people couldn't self-segregate in that way, and that people who do have the resources to put their children in private schools then will actually use those resources instead to improve the public schools that now they're forced to send their children to?
So I'm not going to get into educational policy. That's way above my pay grade, but that's an interesting idea, right, sir?
You could delve into, we talked a lot about racial divide, but just economic divide. Was there city planning to plan different economic areas, or would that allow that to happen now?
So the question was, does city planning, or has it in the past, involved economic classes, not just race? Not to the extent. Now, there is a strong correlation between race and class, right? And that's a whole nother story that I can talk about. It involves a monopoly game. But to my knowledge, no, there is not, we are going to plan this for low-income families, we're going to plan this for high-income families. And, you know, I think today we go back to what Maury was talking about, that the ideal neighborhood has places for all. If you think of Meridian Kessler, maybe not today, but back in the day, you had Meridian Street, which is where the bank presidents lived, the big mansions. A couple blocks in, you had kind of the managers, the executives, nice houses. Then on the side streets, you had kind of small houses, small cottages, and then you got to College Avenue, where we had transit, and you had worker housing, right? You had duplexes and apartments and things like that. And so you had one neighborhood that everyone fit in, right? And so I think that's the type of neighborhood we, at least as a planner, I would like to get us back to. All right, we are a little over time, so I don't feel offended if you leave, but I know that some of you are very interested in this topic, and I'll keep answering questions as long as you have them. We've also got Lee and Maury, and I don't want to hog the microphone, but if you have questions for them, too. Ma'am?
My question is about IPS and the demise thereof. Charter schools have come along and have taken students away from IPS. Of course, the whole idea was to get funding out of IPS and put it to the other schools. Get more funding to other schools. IPS was absorbing $2 million. So the breakdown of IPS, would you explain to me how the charter schools are affecting IPS?
So again, I'm not an education policy expert. I'll give you the pros and cons in my mind as a planner of charter schools versus public schools.
And are they only in Center Township?
No, so
in other townships?
Charter schools are in other townships. They are concentrated in Center. Now, charter schools, from a neighborhood development perspective, one of the biggest challenges we have in revitalizing neighborhoods is the schools. And so it's trying to attract people of choice to come to your neighborhood with a school system that, regardless of the facts, they're not happy with. right? And so if we want to get those people back, one of the things we can do is provide some educational choice, and that's where a charter comes in, right? And so on one hand, you get the neighborhood residents back. We have their tax base, and so Hamilton County doesn't have it, we have it, because they've chosen to live here because we've got a high-performing charter school option now. But on the other hand, yes, there is the criticism that charters cream the crop and take the best students out of IPS and pull the money with them. And so both of those arguments are probably right. You know, I'm not an educational policy person, but I will say from a neighborhood perspective, the fact that we have charter options now has been a boon to many of our neighborhoods that are coming back because we've taken that reason out of people's minds. Now the thing that's hard about it is that you've got so many choices here. You've got public traditional, you've got public magnets, you've got charters, you've got privates. If I move my family to Fishers, I know that tomorrow a bus will pick up my kid and take them to a pretty good performing school. If I'm moving to a neighborhood in Indianapolis, I've got application timelines and deadlines, and depending on when I move to town, I may not be able to get into the school I want, and it's extremely hard to figure out. And so that is one of the byproducts a team of people is working on, is how to streamline the Marion County education process so it's easier to figure out.
But as they're taking these schools, these charter schools are taking these students and then you're reducing the number of schools that are actually being utilized, and then therefore you have the further demise of the community, because you have this humongous building that's now a big weed lot and crime, you know, it just...
Yep, and so for a long time, schools were the center points of neighborhoods, and now many of them are not. Many of even the IPS schools are magnets, and so they draw kids from across the IPS and even sometimes across the county. And so that is one of the challenges we face in public education from a neighborhood building perspective, is we have more choice, but there's less camaraderie, space, you know, people coming together on a common theme. So
I like charter schools. I'm not talking about any means the results there.
I'm not pro or con charter school. All right, ma'am. Yeah, and so Lee, now that she's not listening, I'll call on her. So the question was, her family's been, for 40 years, has owned a home in Martindale, Brightwood, in one of those areas that's, you know, declining in value. And so what can she do to start attracting development, reverse that tide, to bring attention back to that neighborhood? And so Maple and Fall Creek has been in a similar situation before. So.
Well. Very similar situation personally. My parents are still in the Mapleton Fall Creek area, have been there since 1977. What I most encourage people to do is talk to their neighbors and to figure out if there is some nefarious activity happening, or there's some criminal elements in your neighborhood. If there is a vacant home that needs to be occupied, make sure that you're contacting both your elected official as well as the City of Indianapolis, specifically the Mayor's Action Center, so that you change the perception of that space by removing that criminal element and possibly attracting someone else to that neighborhood. And then working with, there is a CDC in the Martindale-Brightwood neighborhood. Okay, well, I can't speak to that, unfortunately. But there are resources that exist geographically throughout Marion County to provide additional funding, as well as advocacy and help with organization. And so if you want to contact our office, and I forgot to make this announcement earlier, I can work on connecting you with the Martindale-Brightwood CDC and other organizations in that area if you're not getting appropriate response from them. But my contact information is mfcdc, that's Mapleton Fall Creek CDC.org. That'll take you to our website. And I can be called at 317-923-5514, or an email is my first name, Lee, spelled Leigh, mfcdc.org. And so use those resources, and if it's not myself, there are additional staff that can help you from a rental or housing or an economic development perspective.
Do you have a quality of life plan in your community?
There is a Near East quality of life plan, and so those are the additional resources that the CDC and different organizations can help. There is a specific housing plan for the Martindale Brightwood, and so it'll be a matter of getting that resource to her and getting them energized. There's a lot of conversation that's happening at the Avondale Meadows YMCA, but specifically United Northeast CDC is helping lead that charge.
All right, thank you. Any other, Marisol?
It's actually for you. What strategies have you found successful to engage renters? Because it's always a challenge in our neighborhood to get renters to feel like they're part of the neighborhood and they have a say in what happens. So what success have you found?
A couple different options that we have utilized are, one, providing some resident financial education as well as support. And so there are resources that we've been able to acquire to help with book rental or school uniforms. And then also, I never undervalue the importance of social gathering. And so we have Tenant Appreciation Day for our renters. And so in addition to our housing products, we have pocket parks that we manage and program. And so we will schedule activities at the park, bounce house, hot dogs, and then we'll bring in additional partners from the Children's Museum or Section 8 if that's a question that some of them have. We'll make sure that there's someone there to answer those questions as well. So we will schedule a time, advertise it. We have a monthly newsletter, so there is regular communication with them, as well as responding to their needs and following through with the questions and giving them an answer. And so we don't want to have individuals say they can't reach us or they're not getting a response. And so we're very intentional to communicate and plan events for them and then support them financially if there are other resources that they need to pay their rent or to pay their utilities or to help with their book rental if they have children.